You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 283 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I want to focus on Yemen. There's been a lot going on there in the past week, and as usual, not much mainstream media attention. There's been some coverage of Yemen, but it's kind of surrounded in the Khashoggi murder and specifically the Senate, but the Congress's attempt to take some action against the Trump policy and the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. And so rather than kind of a shield of the Yemeni people with the humanitarian crisis there, the U.S. is looking to end support of the Saudi war in Yemen because we're mad at Saudi Arabia. There is some new information coming out on the humanitarian crisis and the extent of that. That's going to be important to cover. And then there's some peace talks going on in Sweden, and I'll get into the details of what's happening there. To share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the Libertarian Institute for all my work, the daily news roundup I post there on the blog. The show, it's all on the home page there, libertarianinstitute.org. And then if you really like the show, think about supporting on Patreon. I do produce some bonus content there, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so Yemen stuff. As I said, most of the mainstream media attention and where I'll get this thing started is on this SJ-Res 54. A lot of senators seem to be going along with it now in the wake of the Khashoggi murder. While there's been, according to ACLED, 56,000 plus deaths recorded in this war, many by the Saudi coalition, which is waging not only a ground war with Sudanese mercenaries, but also an air war against Yemen. But, with the Khashoggi murder, and with Donald Trump taking, and very forcefully so, the side of Saudi Arabia, and really in the wake of evidence of strong indications that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was involved with the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Trump administration doubles down on its relationship with Mohammed bin Salman and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So Congress is, I think, looking to take some political vengeance there. The good news is that even though it's for the, kind of wrong reasons, this one might have the right outcome. The problem is that, the senators aren't ideologically stuck on the fact that the United States needs to get out of Saudi Arabia or get out of Yemen and end the support for the Saudi genocidal war there. Very few senators understand that, maybe 4 or 5. Chris Murphy had an excellent op-ed in, I believe, CNN, where he describes the war in Yemen as hell on earth. And so check that out. I will link to it in the show notes page. It's something that was written by a senator, so if you have a Democratic friend, share this article with them. It may be something that, they could kind of latch onto. But like I said, for this reason, though, the process with SJ-Res 54 is going to be critical because there's going to be a lot of times where the teeth could be stripped out of this bill, and it'll become more of a recommendation to the president of the United States that the Congress really doesn't support this war. What we need is a bill brought to the President of the United States that says we are invoking our constitutional war-making powers to say you cannot wage this war. So, not only do we have to make sure we're pressuring our senators to support the bill itself, but that they're informed along the amendment process and able to, vote for and create an overall bill that will make sure the U.S. ends its support for this genocidal war. Now, the reason I call it a genocidal war is because if you look at what Saudi Arabia has done, along with the Emirates, the Egyptians, and the Sudanese, they've waged a brutal bombing campaign of Yemen. And this has included hitting, schools, cholera treatment centers, roads, bridges, water treatment facilities, weddings, and even, going as low as bombing a flock of sheep, at times, and just completely destroying farm infrastructure and making sure that the people of Yemen are not able to produce their own food. Saudi Arabia, backed up by the U.S. Navy, controls the coastline of Yemen and is preventing many ships from getting there. Now, it's not officially in a blockade. What Saudi Arabia does is they've created this brutal inspections regime in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and basically it takes a few weeks at best to get through the Saudi inspections. At time, I think they made ships travel all the way up to a port in Saudi Arabia before they're able to dock in even southern ports in Yemen, and sometimes forced to go about the inspections twice, even if it's an international aid ship. So, we now have a country in Yemen which the infrastructure has been decimated, the food infrastructure intentionally. And we're getting numbers from international aid groups. The UN has, I guess, a 5-tier phase system to, what the conditions are like in a country. There's now 4 million people in Yemen in phase 4, and this is emergency. There's 250,000, a 250,000 here, in what is phase 5. The only other place in the world that this is even the case is in South Sudan, and there's only 2,500 or 25,000 people. So we're talking 10 times as many in Yemen that are now in these catastrophic conditions. One UN agency said that there's 70,000 people plus in Yemen now who are living in straight up famine conditions. These are the people that are absolutely just starving to death. I've talked about on the show numbers that I think are very important, and ones that I think we could communicate to people, and that this organization, Save the Children, has found that 85,000 people have died of deprivation, starvation, treatable disease since the start of this war in April of 2015. And then another group points out that 53% of the Yemeni population is now in a situation where they face severe acute malnutrition. This means that, there's people who legitimately don't know how they're going to be able to eat. There's no food around whatsoever. These are the people who are eating leaves. They're boiling them down into a green paste and, choking that down for the little nutrition that they could get. A large portion of the country is living in, just on the brink of that, where they don't know where they're going to get food. And that's, probably their next step. I mentioned a couple times on this show in the past, but not in a whole lot of detail, that Sudan has provided mercenaries for the Saudi coalition to fight alongside the limited forces that make up the Saudi coalition's ground forces in Yemen. These include some forces still loyal to the internationally recognized government of Yemen. The leader there spends most of his time, a guy named Houthi, in Saudi Arabia. There's a Muslim Brotherhood group, Al-Islah, and they are part of that coalition. There's a group of fighters cobbled together by the UAE that's heavily aligned with, different Wahhabist and either former or current AQAP or ISIS affiliate members in Yemen, and they're all thrown into that coalition paid. And then you have the Sudanese mercenaries, and I'm sure there's some tribal forces in different areas who end up on the same side as the Saudi coalition. They may not always, I guess, be a part of the larger group either. I saw a week ago that there was actually one territory in Yemen that was looking just to declare independence from everyone else. In this article at the American Conservative, Mark Perry explains that basically what's going on is that the Saudi government is providing financial incentives to Sudan in order for Sudan to send these mercenaries to Saudi Arabia. That's a very dark thing. If you really think about what's going on here, where Sudan's only providing these mercenaries not because they believe in the mission or the fight, but because Saudi Arabia is paying them to do so. And so, you gotta imagine that these young men in Sudan who end up in the military and in these mercenary forces probably didn't have, a whole lot of choices where it wasn't like the U.S. where you go and enlist. And so, you're looking at a situation that seems very close to Saudi Arabia paying for, Sudanese, mercenary slaves. Is kind of a very disgusting practice that I think should be heavily called into question. But Perry explains, what their role has been, kind of the conflicts and the politics between Saudi Arabia and Sudan that has made it possible. And it's just very fascinating. So for those of you who have been interested in the Yemen war all along, definitely worth a read. Another note on that, those kind of coalition forces on the ground there, apparently it's not going well in the city of Taiz. That city is, I think, the third largest in Yemen. It's kind of located in south central Yemen, north of Aden, south of Sana'a and Hadada. And on one side, it's surrounded by Houthi forces, and there may have been, I'm guessing, probably less Houthi forces looking to take the city of Taiz recently with, the besiegement of Hadada, and then attacks on other areas of the battlefront as well. But I think there's kind of a general ceasefire going on right now in Yemen because of the peace talks. There's at least been an end to the ground push for the port of Hadada while these talks have been going on. But while, now the Houthis aren't there to fight against the fighters in the city, those backed by the UAE, the Al-Qaeda linked forces, and then the Muslim Brotherhood forces backed by Saudi Arabia are squabbling with each other now. And so one thing that I think is important to, that we could kind of point out from this example too, is just that the humanitarian situation in Yemen right now is really bad. But even if these peace talks that I'm going to talk about here create a situation tomorrow where everybody lays down their arms, it doesn't mean that everybody gets to eat, on Friday. There's been so much destruction to the Yemeni infrastructure. And I'm sure it's going to, take generations to rebuild the amount of bombs that have been dropped there in remote areas, on remote bridges and roads, that, as Will Porter explained like 2 years ago, it creates a situation where the nearest hospital is 2 hours away and it moves it to 20 hours away because, the roads have been bombed out. One of the more closer hospitals has already been destroyed. Bridges are destroyed and you have to drive very far around, to get to the help you need. And also, I mean, there's been tons of people in Yemen who haven't been paid for years. The Saudis relocated the central bank of Yemen from the capital city of Sana'a to the southern city of Aden. And along with that move, stopped paying the civil servants in northern Yemen. And so for the past, probably 2+ years now, now that I'm thinking about this, those people have not received any wages. And so even if this war is over, it's a capital poor country. It's going to take a lot of aid to rebuild that place. And then there's going to be all this other fighting that needs to be resolved. So even if, tomorrow the Houthis and the, Houthi government are able to work out a solution, we've seen in the past that there's separatists in Yemen who wish to create like a separate Yemen state and have actually taken the city of Aden from the Saudi-backed government. We see this fighting in Taiz. We've seen, different AQAP bombings of recruitment centers for Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So there's a lot more complexities to just resolving this one thing. And the worst, it's just important to realize that just because, the situation today is only 4 million people in that phase 4 emergency stage, it doesn't mean that ending the conflict is going to save all those 4 million people. Now, the talks have, I think, generally been positive. There were threats that people were going to walk away from the talks before they started, but the kinks were worked out there. The talks have at least started to happen. So far, it doesn't look like anything's going to happen with Hadada. There's just too much controversy there. I think the Houthis are pushing to turn over to the UN, and the Saudi government doesn't want that. There has been an agreement for about 15,000 prisoners to be swapped. This is probably a good trust building agreement. And so while the fighting in Yemen will likely continue after these talks, at least there is like a positive step forward diplomatically there. Again, the problem is that we're already getting into like the severe humanitarian crisis situation in Yemen where we really can't afford any more fighting. The serious progress needs to be made. And so it's, really for that reason that I emphasize and highlight so much the need for the support of SJ Res 54, because with the withdrawal of United States support for the Saudi coalition, it'll really hamper their ability to continue to wage that war and that blockade of Yemen. And maybe then we'll see Saudi Arabia ease up and the people of Yemen eat. Two other interesting notes here. The first is a story out that says the Pentagon undercharged Saudi Arabia for all the mid-air refueling they supplied them as they bombed Yemen. So I think it really probably shines a light on several issues. One, the United States wasn't, just providing that mid-air refueling as a service to the Saudis. They were doing it as a favor. Which I think makes us a little bit more involved. It also shows how poor the Pentagon bookkeeping is that, nobody realized this up to now. and how little accountability there is for the Pentagon and what they do overseas. This should be a big deal. If nothing else, they're giving away, free U.S. taxpayer dollars to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia sits on his, I think, $500 million yacht, while, there's Americans on welfare, and here the Pentagon is giving them away our stuff for free. And how little Congress has paid attention. That they haven't noticed this in the budget and all that. It's terrible. Also, we have a U.S. State Department official coming out against SJ Res 54, saying that it'll send the wrong message to withdraw from this war. So, think about all the terrible things, I said are going on in Yemen, and the State Department says that would be a terrible thing to try to end it. A little bit more stuff on Saudi Arabia here. Khalid bin Salman, the younger brother of Mohammed bin Salman, and then Ned's son of the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, has returned to Washington, D.C. It was originally reported that he would never return. After the Khashoggi murder, he was recalled to Saudi Arabia. Now he's back. That's, I think, an interesting move. I guess it signals to me that the Saudis really aren't fearful of prosecution, unless, of course, they're dangling him as bait. And they're kind of let him be the sacrifice here. Let the U.S. arrest and prosecute him. Because it does seem that, he was potentially involved as the one who told Khashoggi that he would be able to safely enter the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, which turned out not to be the case. So, maybe he coordinated this with his brother, and then, the U.S. isn't able to indict somebody. So maybe he's a sacrifice there, but I think it's more likely a signal that, the Trump administration is not going to pursue charges against anyone in Saudi Arabia or look to, really attack anyone from the Saudi royal family for, the Khashoggi murder. Saudi Arabia, along with the rest of the OPEC states, reached a deal with Russia for oil production cuts in 2019. I believe it's 1.2 million barrels a day in total. A large chunk of these barrels are from Saudi Arabia and Russia. My sense is that this would be counter to U.S. interests. I would think Donald Trump would want cheaper oil, especially since he's trying to completely shut off the Iranian spigot. And so if Saudi is having production cuts along with the rest of the OPEC countries and Russia at the time where you're trying to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero, that could, I guess, risk a spike in the oil price, which I don't think would be good for, Trump as we're looking at a re-election coming up here. All right, the last story here and this one I think is very important. The son-in-law of Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, apparently advised Mohammed bin Salman after this, Khashoggi story broke on how to weather the storm. And so very interesting. I don't know if, there's any legal problems here, but certainly there's a lot of moral and ethical issues here, that we have a close advisor to the president of the United States advising the leader of a foreign country on how to kind of, navigate the United States, because we're going to be a key player and potentially holding Saudi Arabia accountable. Whatever advice he gave, I guess it worked out. But probably the more prominent thing here, which wasn't the lead for the story, but that is Jared Kushner became a very big supporter for Mohammed bin Salman in the White House following the Khashoggi murder. I want to just mention the story that we have, this getting a lot of attention. Apparently, 2 Russian nuclear-capable bombers have arrived in Venezuela. This, I think, is, being played up a little bit by the Russiagate conspiracists. I'm sure in some sense that this, may be a small show of force by Russia towards the United States. We certainly have a lot of nuclear-capable bombers in their neck of the woods. And so, while, I oppose the escalation, looking at it in context, it doesn't seem to me to be a big deal. On Libya, to just kind of continue with the oil production cuts, we have a militia shutting down a oil field in Libya that I think produces around 315,000 barrels of oil a day. So far, the media that I've read on this, which has been pretty limited, has cast these, armed tribesmen apparently as protesters and not, smeared them more as, insurgents or anything like that. Apparently they're upset about some local issues and, protesting there by shutting down this oil field. Not sure how long it's going to go on or, this is one of those things that sometimes you really don't even get the coverage anywhere, that the oil fields reopened, whether, the maybe oil companies will be able to hire some fighters to kick them out of town, or if, one of the competing governments of Libya could do that. Last thing I want to mention here, 2 U.S. top army positions are about to be filled. For chairman of the Joint Chiefs, we're going to have an Army guy, General Milley, and then CENTCOM commander, it's going to be the current, I believe, Pentagon spokesman, General McKenzie. Both of these guys to me seem generally cookie cutter generals. I don't see anything that makes them stand out and that they're going to be particularly good on any issues or not. On my episode related to the U.S. strikes against the Assad government, I talked quite a bit about General McKenzie just because he was involved in the press conference. Really, he didn't seem that hawkish against Assad, but overall, he looks like just another general. All right, that's where I'll wrap up today's show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com, minds.com/immersionnews, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter @KYAAALE,